Welcome back. So in this video, what we want to achieve is to actually display the data not only in the logcat, which is not visible to the user, but on the application itself. So here in the history activity, we want to display a recycler view. So we need to have an adapter for every single entry. So let's go ahead and set up such an adapter. Of course, it doesn't have to be as complicated because we will not need an update listener, neither a delete listener, because we are not going to update or delete the entries. They should just be there permanently. Of course, you can go ahead and implement the delete listener if you ever want to delete entries manually as well, or want to have that in your application and allow this to the user. But generally speaking, we are going to need a history adapter, which will be similar to this item adapter, but as I said, in a simplified fashion. So let's go ahead and set it up. So we can get inspired by our room database, and you can have it open as the second screen if you want to, and just try it by yourself. And we have used multiple adapters already, but what we're going to need is, of course, to have the row itself. So this is the item history row. So each individual item should look like this, as we have seen at the end of the last video. So now let's go ahead and set up such an adapter. Therefore, I'm going to go over to my folder here and create a new Android Kotlin file. And this one will be the history adapter. Okay, so I'm going to call this one history adapter. History adapter. Let's go. This will, of course, inherit from our beautiful adapter class from Recyclerview. So Recyclerview dot adapter, and now we need to pass in the view holder. And as we always do, we create our own view holder class inside of it. So let's do that here as well. I'm just going to call this one view holder with using view binding. So it will be item history row binding, which is the name of our XML file. You can see here item history row and then binding as always. Okay, and this will inherit from Recyclerview view holder. And we need to pass in the binding object here as well. Otherwise, it won't work. But of course, I want to pass the root of the binding object, which just means this entire linear layout, basically the entire file. Okay, so just saying, okay, this is how the view holder should look like. Now I need to get access to the individual items that we have on our item history row XML file. So one is going to be the linear layout itself, then the text view, and this other text view. So this is just going to look like this. LL history item main, which uses the binding object to access the history item main. Then the text view item, which gets the text view item from the binding, and TV position from the binding TV position. Okay, and now we can use our view holder that we have just created, which is inside of our history adapter class, and it's called our view holder. And here we need to add the brackets. And when we do that, we of course need to implement the members, as we have done many times so far. Okay, now let's go ahead and implement them. Item count, well, of course, our history adapter needs to get a parameter here as well. And the parameter will just be a list of our items. So let's call this one private val items. And usually we would go ahead and create an array list, or get an array list of rather complex items, which would be objects that we would create. But in this case, we're going to really keep it simple. It's just going to be strings, because we don't have an extra property how we called those entries. Okay, so it will just be strings, which means every date is just going to be a string, and we're going to pass that string array to our history adapter. Because if you look at it in our history activity, you see that we're getting this list, and this list is just a list of, well, history entities, but we are not going to get it as history entities, but actually what we want to get is just this date. So now you could of course say, yeah, let's use history entities here, but it really just has one property. So we can simplify it and just use the date itself, which is of type string. So that's why we have this string array list here. Okay, so now let's go ahead and say how many items we're going to return, and this will be return items.size as always. Now the onCreate view holder, that's going to be, as always, our own view holder that we created here, this view holder here. So return view holder with our item history binding or history row binding inflate, using our layout inflator with our parent context as always. Okay, and we need to pass the parent as well as the attached to parent false setting, and that should pretty much do it. Okay, so now let's go ahead and take care of every single row. So how should every single row be handled? Well, first of all, let's get the date. So I'm going to get the date, which is going to be of type string, from my items. So I need to get it at the position because I want to assign this date to my text view. And I need to get the position itself as well. So we can just use the holder, which is this view holder, and we can just set its text view position text to be the position +1. So position +1, because position starts counting at 0. So if we have an, like here, you see here, if we have this entry here, it starts at 0, and we don't want it to start at 0. We want it to start at 1. So we are going to say position +1. Now, unfortunately, position is an integer and 1 is an integer, so we need to convert the result of this calculation into a string so that we can store it in the text property of our text view position, which is going to be this text view here, as you see. Okay, and now let's do the same thing with our other text view, which is our item itself. So let's set the text of it to be the date. And now if we want to get this same thing that we had with our other room history example, let me see, where we had multiple different entries. So here, let me just enter something where we had changing colors. So every second one was with a gray background, the other second ones were with a white background. So if we want to have this altering background color stuff, we just need to go ahead and use the same approach as we have done in the room database. So let's just get inspired from it. Therefore, we have had our item adapter with this code here. Okay, so if position, set background color. So let's do the same thing in our new project here. Of course, the LL, the linear layout, is now called history item main. And the context, let me see, get color context. So we need to have a context object, or alternatively, we can even do that. Actually, we can do it without passing any context. We just parse the color. So there we would need the context if we want to use a color from our colors XML file, but we can also just parse the color. So just hard code it in here. So color dot parse color, and either way would have been fine, right? You could have used the same approach there. So I'm just going to use the white color here. This is white, and this one will be gray. So let's do the same thing where we pass the color. So we set the background color to be parsed, and I think we use something like EB here. So EB, and not as many values. Okay, so this will give us this color effect that we have here, this background color effect. Okay, so I think that should be pretty much it for our history adapter. And now let's of course use this history adapter inside of our history activity, because that's where we want to make sure to display it. So let's go over to get all completed dates, because here what we want to do is we want to of course run this for loop here, but we're going to check if all completed dates isn't empty. We won't need this for loop because this was just for us to test it. So we check if all completed dates list isn't empty, and only then do we want to run some code, which means only then do we want to use our binding object to get access to the text view history and so forth. So binding text view history, and let me see, do we have the binding here? we do have binding. But I'm not sure whether we set up the history activity already, so the XML file. So let me get rid of this line for now. Let's go over to our layout and see if we have anything in our history. Oh yeah, we only have the toolbar. That's why. Okay, so we only have the toolbar. Of course, we need to add a proper user interface in here. So I'm just going to use this right here. Let me go over it real quick. So we still have our toolbar, we still use a constraint layout, and generally speaking, I want to have this here. Okay, so this is what I want to have, this layout. You can see we have the toolbar at the top, then we have our text view, which says exercise completed, or exercises completed, or whatever. Then we have our recycler view, and then we have this text view, which says no data available. So this text view should be visible by default, and this recycler view, as well as this text view, should only be visible if we have any history data to be displayed. So let's look at it. We have this text view here, which is going to be at the bottom of our toolbar, history activity. Then we call it text view history. Then we have the recycler view, which will be underneath text view history. It will be gone by default. So this is going to be the default visibility. And then we have this text view at the bottom, which is just saying that we have no data available. So we haven't finished exercises yet. We could, of course, say something like do some exercise now, or something like that to motivate someone who gets to this history screen. And this should be also underneath the toolbar history activity. But it should be at the same time to the bottom of the parent. So it should be basically dragged towards the top as well as towards the bottom, but then be in the center. So that's what we do with this gravity center. So we're just saying, okay, center this no data available thing and constrain it towards the toolbar as well as towards the bottom of the screen. Okay, so now let's use this activity history XML file inside of our history activity KT file, because now we can use this binding object to access the properties in our XML file. So to access the text views. So let's do that. Let's access our text view history here, which will be binding.tv history. And I'm going to set that to be visible. So visibility, well, view.visible. Because if we have any data, we want to make it visible. If we don't have data, we want to make it invisible. And the same goes for our recycler view. So we want to make that one visible as well. So view.visible. And we want to make our text view that says we don't have any data invisible. So text view, no data available. Visibility should be set to view.invisible. Okay. So now we can set the recycler view to be set up, and let me actually, before we do that, let me add the else block. This will make it a little easier for you to follow, I believe. So here in the other case, we're going to do the opposite. So we're going to make this stuff here invisible or gone, and this text view that says no data available, this one here, visible. So if we have no data, display it. Otherwise, don't display it. And now we can set up our recycler view. So here our recycler view needs to have a layout manager. So let me get access to this recycler view and set up its layout manager property to be a linear layout manager, because I just want to have items to be on top of each other. Now I cannot just use this here because we are inside of a lifecycle scope. So we're in a closure. So this is code that if we use this, then it will believe it's inside of the DAO or something like that. So here we can just make sure that we use the history activity context. So here, let me see, did I write it correctly? No, I did not. Activity, like this. Okay. So now that we have our recycler view, we need to set up the dates for it. So let's get the dates, which will be an array list of strings. Okay. And then let's get the dates from our all completed dates list. So it's this one here that we get from our fetching all data. So we call this method that will give us all the data that we have in the history table. And now we can use it because this is the data that we get, right? All completed dates. And if it's not empty, we're going through all of them and we're going to create a date out of every single entry. And now we can add every single date to our dates array list that we have here, which is just an array list of strings, and can assign it to our Recyclerview after, because if you look at our Recyclerview adapter, it requires exactly that. It requires an array list of strings. So let's add the date in here. And I think date itself is not going to be it. We need to use date.date, because the date will be a history entity, which is not a string, but the history entity has an entity called, oh, let's jump over to the history entity to see that. History entity, it has a string property that is called date. Okay, so we get that date property by getting date.date. Okay, so now that we have all of the dates, we can create our history adapter because it needed to have our dates, which we now can assign here. So let's use the dates. And now we can assign this history adapter to our Recyclerview adapter property, as always. So always the same approach, right? You need to set up your adapter. You need to prepare the list that you want to use, and usually it's an array list. You need to then go ahead and set up the list, fill it with data. In our case, we get the data from our database, and then use this data inside of the adapter, or pass it to the adapter, and then use this adapter that you set up as the adapter for your Recyclerview that you have prepared. So here we can just use our history adapter now. And this should pretty much do it. So let's go ahead and test this and see if we have any exercises that we have finished inside of our history screen or history activity. And then we can also just quickly finish some more exercises. So let's go over to our history. We see we have finished this exercise at 10:23:36. So exercises completed. And even though you should add an S here. And now if we go through it once again, we will then see that this new entry has been added also. All right, so this will make it white, I think, from the background. So the first will be gray, then white, then the third one would be gray again, because that's what we have set up inside of our history adapter on bind view holder. So here we're iterating the colors. So we finished the exercise now. Let's jump over to the history and we see the new history has been added. So that's pretty much it. So now our application is pretty much complete. Now you could of course make it prettier. Make sure that your main color is also this greenish color, or, well, basically just extend the application to whatever you need it for. So I hope you enjoyed this chapter, and I hope you can use this to build your own specific apps that have to do either with timers or with Recyclerviews or with permanent data storage and so forth. So thanks a lot and see you in the next video.